The first finding that I'd like to present on relates to forced marriages. Both factions of Boko Haram, Jazz, and the Islamic State West Africa province have engaged in various forms of sexual and gender-based violence towards women and girls. Most prolific has been their forced marriage of women and girls, with the kidnapping of women and girls being for this explicit purpose of marriage. While both factions have engaged in forced marriages, they have taken different approaches. In some cases, women and girls have been given a semblance of choice in their marriages. The Islamic State West Africa province faction would present women and girls with several potential suitors to choose from. However, not selecting one was not an option. Young girls, women who were already married, and widows were not excluded. Those who tried to remain unmarried were often met with threats of execution themselves, of their parents, or the communities to enforce compliance. In Nigeria, for example, a young girl explained to us that after her community was captured by Jazz, a message was sent around that in 3 days, all the young girls had to be married off. If not, the faction would start killing people. In our last round of surveys in Nigeria, 47% of the women and girls who were associated with Boko Haram married somebody while they were with the group. This was often not just one marriage. Women and girls had to remarry after the death of their husbands, which in many cases meant multiple forced marriages. In the sample in Nigeria from our recent survey, a third of the women and girls that we interviewed reported having more than one husband. For most, this was 2 different husbands, but for a small percentage, about 5 to 6%, it was 3 or more husbands. In Maiduguri last year, I met a young woman who was forced to marry a Boko Haram fighter. When I asked her how old she was at the time that she got married, she laughed. She said she hadn't even started developing physically at the time. That's how young she was. She told me that her husband was eventually arrested by the military, and soon she was forced to remarry another Boko Haram fighter. By the time she was 16, she had been forcefully married twice. Next slide, please. The second finding relates to the exit of women and girls. Upon exit, many of these women continued to be married to the men they were forced to marry, begging the question as to what reintegration can look like in these situations. Once again, out of our sample in Nigeria, the women and girls who first got married while they were with Boko Haram, more than 83% report that they're still married to their Boko Haram husbands today. In many cases, divorce is simply not an option for these women. There are often no legal avenues to do so, but there are also socioeconomic necessities at play. In our qualitative research, girls and women who were with Boko Haram indeed highlighted that they didn't want to get divorced, as this would render them economically very vulnerable. These women and girls depend on their husbands for survival, which often ties them to them. Separating would simply not be a solution, as their families would immediately have to marry them off again to somebody else, as they would not be able to look after them. In Chad, some women and girls were indeed able to secure divorces after exits because of the legal clarity there. The law requires consent for marriage to be considered valid. Hence, forced marriages are not considered valid marriages. If they had been previously married before being with Boko Haram, they were given a choice to which husband they wanted to return to. The husband that they had been previously married to, or their husband from their time with Boko Haram. Yet, despite the clear process in Chad, many women and girls did not or could not pursue a divorce if doing so meant leaving their children behind. In cases where women and girls had been abducted and later married, any children would, under Islamic law, still belong to their first husband. The first husband, in some cases, would accept these children in their household, but this wasn't necessarily always the case. Women could not keep sole custody of their children unless they exited Boko Haram alone. The reality forced many women and girls to choose between freeing themselves from a forced marriage or staying in a marriage to be with their children. Simply not a real choice. Next slide, please. Some of the return and reintegration structures supported by the international community we've seen inadvertently reinforces some of the violence against women and girls. In Nigeria, for example, women and girls who exited Boko Haram alone would be held in transit centers or camps until their husbands also exited. They would then be reunited with the men they were forced to marry by the authorities in the camps. It, however, remains unclear if they were given a choice to be reunited with these men. In other cases, benefits at certain transit centers would first be given to men who would then distribute them onwards to their families. It also meant that married or widowed or unmarried women and girls would have to arrange for a man to receive their assistance on their behalf, and often the men would take a portion of this assistance as payment. Post-exit, many women and girls continue to live in isolation and in these forced marriages. In some cases, their reintegration was hindered by husbands who continue to exert control and continue to enforce strict gender norms from their time with Boko Haram. They limited women and girls' abilities and mobility, making it difficult for them to establish key aspects of their lives, such as social networks and livelihoods. This rendered them all the more reliant on their husbands. These already tense unions were often placed under even greater stress, as husbands struggled to provide for their families in the midst of an economic and humanitarian crisis. Tension in the home over providing sufficient food and income, according to some of the women and girls that we spoke to, had led to gender and domestic violence. Next slide, please. All of this to say is that the hardship and violence faced by these women and girls does not begin with or end after their time with Boko Haram. Many women and girls self-demobilize and reintegrate directly into communities, deeply affected by ongoing insecurity, climate change, and a devastating humanitarian crisis. This self-demobilization meant that they often receive less support. Even when going through formal pathways of surrender, as they are not seen as a threat, they are not prioritized for support, even when they have multiple children in their care and very limited livelihood opportunities. Support continues to be geared towards the men. When women do access programming, it is often not tailored to their unique needs. Social and gender inequalities have often played a role in the recruitment of these women and girls and became further entrenched while they worked with the group. The international community has long criticized the gender and sexual-based violence committed by Boko Haram, but in some occasions has failed to see how these legacies of violence continue long after women and girls have exited the group. In terms of recommendations, if you go to the next slide, please. The first recommendation that we'd like to make today is to start viewing women and girls exiting armed groups, not just as wives and daughters, but as their own agents with distinct needs. Women and girls have been viewed as victims in this and in many other conflicts, and this largely ignores the multifaceted experiences with armed groups. Some women and girls have been fighters, supported by making weapons or by providing logistical intelligence support, while others have had key support roles, such as being cooks, growing food, or being wives. This narrow casting of women and girls has translated to DDR programming, with the support given, when it is given, really fails to address the gender dimension of many of their needs. A second key takeaway is by supporting their socioeconomic independence through sustainable livelihoods that really match their realities. Many of the areas in which these conflicts are occurring are climate change hotspots and in the midst of humanitarian crises, which makes reintegration all the more challenging. We've seen that while everybody is affected to different degrees, it is often women and girls who are hardest hit and struggle the most to restart their livelihoods. Men in some cases are able to diversify or restart their livelihoods because they are more skilled or can migrate, while due to social norms, for example, around familial and childcare, women could not. When they are able to do so, the livelihoods that they've restarted were neither particularly sustainable in the long term nor resistant to climate shocks. Supporting women through literacy and financial education and livelihood diversification program is key. Thirdly, and I'm sure my colleagues will touch on this later, but it's to work to enhance the meaningful participation of women and girls, both as beneficiaries and program participants, but also as practitioners in DDL. This is really key to ensure that their needs and perspectives are adequately represented. And lastly, I would like to touch on the importance of community-based organizations, and this can really not be emphasized enough. These communities, these organizations who come from the communities and work with community members are often best placed to support the reintegration of ex-associates and foster community dialogues and interventions aimed at acceptance and reconciliation. It is key that to have dedicated and sustainable fundings for these activities, especially those run by grassroots women's organizations. Next slide. Well, I've given you today a very brief summary of a report that we recently published, and by scanning the QR code on your screen, you'll be able to download the report and read about more of our findings in much more depth than I've been able to get into today. On that, I'd like to turn over to my colleague Hana Salama for the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for being here and bearing with us. I just switched to the French channel, so I believe that interpretation is now available en français. And obviously, I will be speaking in French. As mentioned by the moderator, Siobhan, I will be presenting UNIDIR's gender and disarmament research on the linkages between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. But before we start, I wanted to give a quick word about the Gender and Disarmament Program at UNIDIR. We are a program that is dedicated to analyzing the gendered impact of armed violence, and we examine how gender norms shape the role of weapons in society. We do this by carrying out research, dialogue, and capacity building activities that contribute to gender equality and improving women's participation in all areas of arms control and disarmament and in security discussions. We really think that by translating gender awareness into policy actions, we can help ensure that arms control and disarmament and processes like DDR deliver for everyone. Our work is made possible through the generous donors that we have, who are Canada, Germany, Ireland, Malta, and Norway for this year. So I will just jump into the presentation and about conflict-related sexual violence, which, as we all know, is a very complex phenomenon. And in fact, it has multiple overlapping causes and enabling factors, some of which are rooted in the conflict itself, and chief among them is gender inequality. However, one of these enabling factors fueling the systematic and widespread sexual violence and conflict is weapons and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. And the reason why I highlight small arms and light weapons is because these types of weapons, and particularly firearms, are the weapon of choice by armed groups that are involved in civil war or internal armed conflict. And that's because that they are relatively cheap, easy to transport, to traffic, and conceal. And this has been recognized by the UN Secretary General over the last several years, including the fact that increased militarization and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons is one of the factors that is fueling CRSV. Beyond this recognition, however, there hasn't been any efforts to, first of all, look at empirically how these two are linked, but secondly, how arms control and disarmament efforts could be leveraged to enhance the prevention of CRSV. So UNIDIR's research, which was published in 2023, and the full report is available on our website, it sought to fill this gap and look at how small arms and light weapons are linked to conflict-related sexual violence, and also identify entry points where arms control and disarmament treaties, instruments, tools, and measures can be leveraged to prevent sexual violence in conflict. Next slide, please. So, what did we find from this research? We found that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in a conflict can be linked to CRSV in two ways. First, directly, as weapon and their ammunition are used by perpetrator to commit rape, to threaten, to coerce individuals into sexual acts against their will, to injure or even kill survivors of and victims of sexual violence. Second, there are also indirect links, as the proliferation of weapons contributes to fueling the conflict itself, and in turn, it propagates the conditions that lead to sexual violence and also other types of gender-based violence. On the direct links, we found that there was very limited data which linked weapons or weapon types to incidents of sexual violence in conflict. Most of the data actually referred to armed actors. When we looked at a specific conflict, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo and the conflict-affected areas there, we found data from an MSF hospital and the Panzi hospital, which indicated that between 40 and 60% of incidents of CRSV indeed involved a weapon. When we tried to identify what kind of weapons or what weapons were they referring to, um, we found that only one civil society organization, which was based on public or publicly accessible data, um, actually identified firearms specifically as part of CRSV incidents. This organization is called Insecurity Insight, and in 2022, between 70 to 90% of the incidents that they recorded in their database in the DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ukraine involved a firearm. So a pretty high correlation um, at that. In terms of indirect links, we found studies from South Sudan and the DRC, which shown, for example, that the same conditions that have led to increasing conflict violence, for example, increased militarization and the proliferation of small arms, had led to an increase in intimate partner violence. A more recent example of this is in Ukraine, where the UN has documented not only many cases of conflict-related sexual violence, which were facilitated by weapons, but also local CSOs have documented a 400% increase in calls to the police about domestic violence and intimate partner violence in January 2023 as compared to the previous time or the previous year in the same period of time. So this just goes to demonstrate that access to weapons and the conflict itself has also impacts on interpersonal violence and violence in the home. And in addition to the direct and indirect links between small arms and sexual violence, our interviews with practitioners in the field also revealed additional links where we think much more research is needed to unpack those links. So, for example, the link between criminal groups often taking advantage of the breakdown in borders and rule of law in a conflict for financial gain to traffic weapons, but also to traffic women and girls for the purposes of sexual exploitation, either cross-border or within a conflict itself. We also saw that criminal groups or armed groups may be using sexual violence as a tool to coerce women into trafficking roles. And in areas such as in the DRC, in the mining areas where armed groups are controlling the mines and are trafficking minerals to sustain, to purchase weapons to sustain the conflict, these areas are also characterized by high levels of sexual violence. So next slide, please. Based on these linkages that I have just explained, our paper proposed an arms control and disarmament toolbox for both the long-term and short-term prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. This toolbox, as we call it, includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, the Firearms Protocol, which are really address the legal and policy frameworks of small arms control, and it really underpins everything, all small arms control efforts, and is useful for supporting long-term and structural prevention. So an example of one of these long-term prevention measures that are related to arms control is the Arms Trade Treaty, which is the first legally binding treaty to explicitly prohibit parties or state parties to the treaties to export arms to countries where there is widespread IHL violation or human rights abuses. And of course, we know that conflict-related sexual violence qualifies as an IHL violation and a human rights abuse under certain circumstances. And in addition to this, which is included in Article 6 of the treaty, we have an additional article, Article 7.4, which specifically requires states to conduct risk assessments on the possibility that weapons can be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence. And I think we can all agree that sexual violence in conflict is a serious act of GBV. So in this sense, CRSV is covered by both Article 6 on human rights and IHL violations, and Article 7.4 specifically targeted at preventing gender-based violence. So that is an example of long-term prevention, but the toolbox also includes measures which can be relevant at different phases of a conflict to limit access to weapons to perpetrators of CRSV. And if we go to the next slide, please, we can see some of these more operational measures. So, for example, before the conflict, using indicators on the accumulation of arms or the price of arms or arms-related indicators can help be integrated into the early warning of CRSV. During a conflict, um, uh, there are several tools that can be leveraged, such as arms embargoes, which can really limit the flow of weapon into the country. And then in the transitional period, we have several tools such as DDR, which was mentioned by my colleague, weapons and ammunition management, and community violence reduction, which can both address weapons, but also the root causes of this violence, contribute to peace building and addressing harmful gender norms, which, as I say, are the root causes of this kind of violence. So to conclude, next slide, please. We had a number of recommendations, and we are looking forward to hearing from you and to getting your feedback on these recommendations, as well as ideas to take them forward. And this includes improving, as I said, the understanding of the linkages. So although now we have a little bit more awareness and more evidence on the linkages between small arms proliferation and sexual violence, we still haven't collected this data systematically. So I think there's work here to support mechanisms which would collect incident-based data, which is disaggregated not only by the identity of the perpetrator, identity of the victim in terms of sex, age, etc., but also include the type of weapon that was involved in the incidents. And this kind of data, when it is aggregated, can really bring attention to these linkages in forums to do with small arms control, but also in prevention efforts or forums such as the Security Council, which are aimed at preventing and addressing sexual violence in conflict and its consequences. And as my colleague said, we should not lose sight of the survivors of these survivors and victims of these types of crimes, and try to include as much as possible survivors and survivors association in prevention efforts, but also in the discussion at the local level, at the national level, on decision making on arms control and disarmament. And so including them, for example, in disarmament campaigns, and as well as when in the transitional period, when looking at the framework for managing weapons and specifically for civilian ownership of weapons, ensuring that community groups and survivor organizations are part of the discussion of how these weapons will be managed in the future. So, in conclusion, I think that there are already a number of tools such as DDR, SSR, and weapons and ammunition management, which are important tools to limit weapons to perpetrators. However, they are not being implemented in a gender responsive way. And this would be important because gender perspectives can contribute to changing gender norms and attitude by promoting women's participation in decision making about security issues, including arms control and disarmament, and thereby really doing both addressing the operational or kind of the immediate causes of CRSV, but also the long-term structural gender inequality of this phenomenon. So thank you very much. And I would like to pass it back straight to Siobhan, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Hana, and thank you both. I think you've highlighted several dimensions, the different dimensions of CRSV in conflict and how potentially the legacy of them lives on, and how even the international community could be helping perpetuate it at times, and these linkages to other challenges we have in society, including the weapons flows and use. So I think those are sort of two areas to kind of complicate the issue even further, and certainly turn us to questions of how we respond, both on the prevention side and in response to victims themselves. So the floor is now open. I'd ask you to raise your virtual hand so I can try to call on people. And we have about 12, 15 minutes for questions, comments. How have these findings resonated with you and the work that you're doing and your portfolio? You know, do you have any good practices that haven't been identified yet, or you think certain best practices or recommendations from either presentation really resonated with you in your work? So I think that's a good way maybe to start. Peter, I see your hand, and please come in.
Thank you so much for the wonderful report. From Uganda, and my little experience with this, for me, looking at this data, I'm wondering, to what extent did you feel that the prevailing socioeconomic conditions provided this, which is a bad thing, but as an option to communities and individuals? In our work, I do public health work, but also in borders and conflict zones. And we've seen, like with HIV, some of the girls, when reached out, when given alternatives to do their own work, say, this is all I have. If I don't have a man in my life, whichever way from he comes, I will not have the grounding in society. To what extent did you find some? If you did, I know. If you didn't, it's fine, but you could also give your thoughts over.
Thank you, Peter. That's a great question about sort of the socioeconomic components that kind of reinforce these relationships. So I think that's an excellent one. I'll see if there's anyone else who wants to jump in. Maybe I'll collect one or two comments or questions, and then we can turn back to the speakers. I see, Mateus, you've also offered one. Do you want to jump in and share as well, not just in the chat, but do you want to ask your question? Would anyone else like to jump in, or should we turn back to the speakers? Maybe while you're thinking, Paul, I'll turn to you. Please introduce yourself and over to you. We can't hear you, Paul. You may still be on mute.
Oui, merci, bonjour. Je ne savais pas qu'on m'avait passé la, la parole en fait. Merci beaucoup, merci Siobhan, merci Francesca, merci Hana pour vos exposés. Merci déjà pour l'organisation de ce webinaire. Les exposés étaient suffisamment instructifs. Ils étaient suffisamment instructifs et je crois aussi que c'est peut-être pour ça que les collègues et moi, on a tardé à poser des questions, c'était suffisamment renseigné. Par contre, il y a quelque chose qui a capté mon attention dans l'exposé de Francesca sur l'impact effectivement des violences à l'égard des femmes dans le cadre des exactions de Boko Haram, notamment en ce qui concerne la récolte des données. Je me suis rendu compte que il y avait à chaque fois une sorte de déséquilibre au niveau des contacts, des personnes contactées, notamment au Cameroun où il y avait plus de femmes et d'hommes approchés que de femmes dans le cas des interviews. Idem au Tchad. C'est peut-être au Nigeria qu'il y a eu peut-être quelques femmes, un peu plus qu'elles ont, pour un problème qui concerne prioritairement les femmes, dont elles sont les premières victimes et dont les bourreaux sont des hommes. Est-ce que c'était voulu de le faire ainsi pour qu'il y ait presque un équilibre de la pensée, ou alors est-ce il n'aurait pas valu mieux d'interviewer encore plus de femmes pour s'assurer que leur voix allait être beaucoup plus portée? Merci.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that question, and I'm sure Francesca can offer some feedback on the methodology and how the research played out in real time. I'll just lastly turn and see if anyone else wants to ask any questions. We also have a question from Mateus in the chat about the connection between conflict-related sexual violence and weapons. And he says there is no violent conflict without weapons, and sexual violence is linked to conflict. Isn't that therefore an indirect link? So that's sort of a question on that front as well. Let me just see if I see any last hands. Okay, why don't we turn back to the speakers and allow them to jump in on any of the questions we've heard from Mateus, Paul, or Peter. Maybe we will start, Francesca, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, Siobhan. I'll address Paul's question first. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for noticing that. This was the totality of the interviews that we did. When we spoke to community respondents and former associates of Boko Haram, there was indeed gender parity. The gender disparity really came in at play when we spoke to government officials who in the region, those working on DDR, are indeed largely men. We sought out as many women as we could, but there is obviously an imbalance purely from the perspective that most of the people working on DDR-related fields in the region are predominantly men, which is why you will see that there were more men interviewed, but community respondents and former associate respondents had an equal gender parity of 50% women and 50% men, as you said, because we wanted to capture both experiences equally. And maybe just to touch on the socioeconomic conditions, I think this is really something that we've seen throughout the research that we've done on the Boko Haram conflict, really on the recruitment, but also on the reintegration side. The socioeconomic component, I think, is a very underappreciated challenge in the conflict. Many of the reasons that we've seen people join Boko Haram are due to socioeconomic circumstances. In some cases, there is no other choice. The only available land to farm or to herd is controlled by Boko Haram, and people have no choice but to join the group in order to be able to continue their socioeconomic livelihoods. On the reintegration side, especially for women, we see, like we said, that they are very much tethered to their husbands for socioeconomic well-being. A woman by herself is simply not able to look after herself and her children once she exits, like any other unaffiliated community members. So we do see the socioeconomic impact very much impacting people's decisions to stay with their husbands or to even look for another husband if they came out alone, because they do realize that it is the support of a husband in this case is very much necessary for their well-being. Back to you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Francesca. Why don't I turn to Hana for any responses to the questions we received?
Thank you, and thanks to Mateus for his question. And I think that as we identified in the paper, there are both direct and indirect links. And as you rightly say, the indirect link is due to the conflict itself. And we see that increased conflict violence also increases interpersonal violence that can be you know, it can or may not be considered conflict-related sexual violence. Sometimes it's just not related to the conflict, but it is violence between or gender-based violence in the home or in interpersonal relationships. But we really do think that the direct link is there because weapons, you know, they're used in the act themselves, but they're also used to threaten and to void any sort of consent. And their coercive power, I think, is much stronger than without a weapon. So it's really important to also emphasize the direct linkages because we can link this to a concrete action that the Security Council can take, which is impose an arms embargo under the SGBV criteria. And yes, there might already be an arms embargo, and there might already because of the conflict itself, but having that criteria also added is important to highlight the problem of CRSV as it relates, you know, to the proliferation of weapons. So yeah, I think we tried to also highlight this in the paper. Thank you, Siobhan.
Thanks, Hana. I think if we go rather quickly, we can probably take this last question from Victoria. So over to you, Victoria.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci beaucoup pour UNIDIR et tout le présentateur de ce matin. J'espère que vous m'entendez.
Très bien.
Ah, ok, d'accord. Voilà. Alors, ma question, ou bien ma préoccupation, c'est au sujet de quand on parle de violence faite à la femme. Pour le cas de la République démocratique du Congo, quand nous voyons que c'est plus de 2 décennies, 30 ans déjà, depuis que cette violence est en train d'avoir lieu, et nous constatons que il y a même les enfants qui ont été issus de violences, de viols, sont en train d'être victimes de viols. Je ne sais pas comment est-ce que, une idée, est-ce que ce sujet-là, ou bien cet aspect-là, vous a intéressé dans le cadre de votre recherche? Parce que ce serait vraiment souhaitable que vous puissiez jeter un coup d'œil pour voir comment est-ce que les enfants, parce qu'une femme a été violée, suite à cette violence, il y a eu un enfant, dont elle a été victime, elle a été grosse, elle a mis au monde un enfant, et cet enfant-là,
Victoria, I think you've disconnected or we can't hear you anymore.
Médical, juridique, elle aura peut-être besoin aussi d'un accompagnement dans la société pour qu'elle soit économiquement autonome. Il y a aussi cet aspect-là. Et puis, au niveau de la jeunesse, peut-être, trouver comment est-ce que occuper ce jeune-là pour qu'il ne pense pas que la vie, pour gagner la vie, il faut tenir les armes. Parce que les armes légères, petit calibre, sont en train de faire beaucoup de victimes. Voilà un peu ma préoccupation. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we got cut off a bit, but I think we get the gist of the question. And in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly turn to the panel for about 30 seconds each in reaction. So this is talking about children who are born of rape in conflict settings. And the DRC obviously is a context that you've highlighted where we've seen a lot of this. And so how do we support and work with these victims as well? So just rapid fire, I'll turn quickly to Francesca and then Hana, because we do need to get to our closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Yes, this is something we've absolutely worked on in Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon in particularly. We often see that women who are exiting Boko Haram are coming out with many children who are born out of these forced relationships, out of forced sexual violence. And it is very much the case of why we are really emphasizing the need to cater not only and support not only the women, but the children as well, that they come up with. They have grown up in very isolated environments and have particular socioeconomic needs that need to be addressed, as well as very heightened psychosocial needs as well. And it is something that we're calling for. The detention needs to be paid to supporting the women and their children that they're coming out with. Hana, over to you.
Thanks. I think I will address the second half of Victoria's question. Merci Victoria pour votre question. And that was regarding like how do we convince the youth in DRC or otherwise to give up their weapons. I think it's an important question, and one thing that UNIDIR has been working on is looking at the issue of masculinities as part of the work that we do on gender and disarmament, addressing the needs and the perspective of men in this context is also really important to look at how we can engage with their masculinities
sur la question de la masculinité.
Highlight that, masculinities doesn't equal
Ce n'est que la
violence.
masculinité ne veut pas dire violence, c'est beaucoup d'autres choses.
That responsible males
donc des hommes responsables n'utilisent pas la violence et qui sont là pour protéger les femmes.
It's definitely an area where we're looking more into, and we would really appreciate any feedback and support in this area of the masculinities work. Thank you.
Thank you, Hana. I want to quickly turn, so we only have a few minutes, and so maybe we could stay 2 minutes on just so we can give due time to our colleague Fatima Yetcha Badu, who is is a senior researcher with Mobukar Consultancy, which is our local partner in the northeast of Nigeria.
Avec le partenaire local dans le nord-est du Nigeria, Fatima a fait énormément d'entretiens.
Of sexual violence in the Boko Haram conflict, and she can really, I think, speak from that.
Elle peut vraiment nous parler de la perspective des victimes.
As we move forward in crafting solutions. So,
alors que nous continuons à essayer de trouver des solutions, à mettre en œuvre des solutions. Donc, je vous passe la parole. Non?
Thank you, Siobhan. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by thanking UNIDIR.
Donc, mesdames et messieurs, chers membres distingués, et donc je travaille donc au programme sur le désarmement et donc pour prévenir la violence sexuelle et donc pour comprendre les tendances et les analyses. Quelqu'un qui vient du nord du Nigeria, j'ai été témoin donc d'un conflit Boko Haram dans ma zone de conflit. Des milliers de femmes ont fui la violence de Boko Haram et j'ai pu leur parler et écouter leur histoire. Je voulais partager quelques-unes de leurs histoires, parce que sans donner leur nom, leurs histoires sont importantes.
At the age of 14. She shared with me the trauma and struggles she faced during her time with the group and the difficulties she encountered while trying to reintegrate back into society after escaping. Her story is a testament to the resilience of women and girls in the face of adversity. Another woman, Fatima, shared with me her horrific experience of witnessing the execution of her father and brothers. Her struggles with PTSD and anxiety today highlight the long-lasting impact of violence on women and girls. Others have shared how their lives today after exiting Boko Haram are more difficult than they had anticipated. Some have even mentioned that they sometimes miss their time with Boko Haram because of the availability of food or the opportunity to engage in religious studies, complexities of their experiences and the difficult choices they were forced to make. As someone who has worked with women and girls affected by the Boko Haram conflict, I have seen the impact of violence on their lives. Many have been subjected to gender-based violence, sexual violence, and forced marriages and other forms of exploitation. The trauma and pain they have endured are evident in their stories. One of the most heartbreaking realities is that many of these girls are children themselves, and they now have children to take care of. And some of them are forced to do this without support from the state or from those close to them who may have shunned them out of fear or shame. This is a burden that no child should ever have to bear. Moreover, some women were forced to marry multiple times, first to a husband before they were abducted, and then again to a Boko Haram fighter. And now, as they return to their communities, they are navigating complex family dynamics and societal expectations. Finally, I would like to make some recommendations on what actions need to be taken in order to help women and girls. Firstly, we need to recognize the complexity of their experiences and avoid reducing them to simplistic labels of victimhood. We need to listen to their stories, amplify their voices, and support their agency. Having said that, I am sure you will agree with me that providing them with access to education, healthcare, and economic empowerment programs will equip them to take control of their lives, regain their dignity, and become active participants of their communities. To set women and girls on a path to sustainable recovery, I believe that we need to address the root causes of violence and conflict. We need to work towards creating a more just and equitable society where women and girls are valued, respected, and protected. Again, as someone who has worked with women and girls affected by conflict for many years, I have seen the importance of providing tailored support and services to help them rebuild their lives. As we mark the 25th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women's peace and security, let us recommit to supporting women and girls in conflict-affected areas. Let us recognize their contributions to peace and security issues and ensure that their voices continue to guide, shape, and shape conflict prevention, disarmament, and peace-building efforts globally. Thank you very much. Over to you, Siobhan.
Thank you, Fatima. And thank you for reminding us that these are real people behind the statistics. And we need to always keep that in mind as we work together, moving forward to improve outcomes for victims, but also to prevent the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. I want to thank our speakers today, Francesca, Hana, Fatima, for sharing these novel research findings and offering some suggestions of ways forward. We very much hope that this is the beginning of deeper engagement with all of you to find evidence-based solutions to address conflict-related sexual violence. Please don't be strangers. Please reach out. We're always interested in feedback on our reports and how we can help you in the work you're doing to be more evidence-based, to bring the right people together, and to find solutions that actually work. So thank you for your time today. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and we hope to be in touch soon. Thank you.